Go on, bro, get stuck in front of the no. They ain't had a fun like this since the last time they overdosed. They've been waiting patiently, Pinocchio to focus no. Back into the game, ain't no back, and never be the same as before. Bash in the brain of these hoes, establish a name that knows the passion of the flame is ignited. You can put out what you like. This ain't exactly what the fuck that I'm talking about when we ride. You deal with you shoot film, you stay inside of the group, you show and stick shoot films. I tell you, but you find them out of mouth, I don't want it. Hey, that motherfucker, anyway that she got me on the tape. Once I touch it, say it, not put away, so now we stay to place. I'm here to help you, so in case you're thinking of saving grace. You can have no text and say my time, I'm through this place so great.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of WWD, What Went Down. Today we're going to be talking about the Bears and Panthers. I don't even know if you can call it a football game. The Bears and Panthers circus act, the comedy show, whatever you might want to call it. It certainly wasn't the fucking glorious game of football, that's for sure. Either way, let's get right into it on the fantasy side of things as always. I'm kicking things off with Toxic. He had Frankie Louvu, who had a good 17 points. This is pretty good news for Toxic, because you would assume with Brian Burns being out on most weeks that the edge rusher Frankie Louvu would start picking up more coverage or more blockers trying to go against him. But he pretty fortunately for Toxic actually did not. He went out there and actually had quite a few tackles solo. He had 6 tackles solo, 5 assists. He normally wouldn't do something like that. Normally he's known for getting sacks and stuff like that. He occasionally has his high tackle games. But I have noticed with Brian Burns actually being out, it has been helping him get more tackles total. He's helping to stop the run, and they're actually still able to use him, which is pretty good news for Toxic, especially since Toxic does actually have Brian Burns. At least that means he does get a boost with Frankie Louvu. I mean, overall, this does put him a solid point in the green. I do think he was a bit over-projected, but this was still a pretty good night for Toxic. Pretty good news overall. Can't complain about it if you're Toxic. And then neither of us had anybody that was healthy playing on our bench, so we'll just move right on to the next guy. Next up, we'll talk about Scrambled and Wiggle Waggled against J-Bay. Scrambled had, oh my god, he had Jesus Christ himself, Tyson Bagent. Tyson Bagent had 162 passing yards, 6 rushing attempts, and 12 rushing yards. I cannot, you know what, no, actually, no, we're going to go with the joking side of things. Tyson Bagent was the best player that I've ever seen play football. Nothing was wrong. The Bears offense went out there and had their way with the Panthers defense, especially since Tyson Bagent was there. Scrambled Wiggle Waggle just is going to win this matchup for the sheer reason of having Tyson Bagent on this roster. J-Bay would have beaten him otherwise, but unfortunately for J-Bay, he had to have gone against Tyson Bagent, which really might have clinched the loss for him here. Anyway, we'll move on to the next set of things here. We had Dictatorship against Mr. Steeler Girl. This is probably one of the more important matchups this week. Because obviously, Scrambled's going to beat J-Bay, and then me and Toxic will be pretty important, but I do think both me and Toxic will probably still make the playoffs, no matter what happens here. We're more playing for seeding at this point, and the thing with me and Toxic is no matter who wins, we're probably going to play each other in the playoffs anyway in the first round, because that's just kind of how the seeding is going to work here, but we'll have to wait and see. With Dictatorship and Mr. Steeler Girl, Dictatorship actually had some pretty good news tonight. First of all, Adam Thielen went out there and had 6 catches for 42 yards on 10 targets. Let me just say this, it's not a bad performance. I'd say it's pretty mediocre. It's not a bad performance at all, but I will just say this, if you are disappointed with this, seeing as his past few games, Adam Thielen's had going into the 30s in points, and he's just been ridiculous all season. He was open all fucking night. Bryce Young is awful. You can say he's a rookie, whatever you want to say. I was pretty big on him going into the draft. You know what I mean? He's a pretty damn good player, don't get me wrong, but oh my god, last night watching him, or not last night watching him, but whenever I watch the game, watching him, he will just ignore wide open people left and right. It's kind of sad. It's even on plays where there's literally no pressure getting to him. We'll talk about the Bears D-line in a bit, but Bryce Young didn't even have much pressure on him. Thielen was able to get open pretty much all night on, I believe he was on a mix of Kindle Vildor and I'm trying to think who else was he on. Kyler Gordon, not Kindle Vildor, my bad. Kyler Gordon is the Bears corner he was on, and yeah, Thielen was pretty much open all night. I can't lie. There's a reason he had 10 targets, but Young just kind of really fucked him over. And then Dictatorship actually went a good point in the green, even though Mr. Steeler won a few points in the red. Dictatorship had Chicago's defense. He made a pretty solid choice when it came to the matchup this week. Carolina's offense sucks. They were able to hold Carolina to 13. They were able to get 3 sacks. They had 6 total tackle for losses. and they only gave up 213 yards. The main problem with this Bears defense is they still don't quite have those playmakers that can go out there and get you your interceptions, go out there and get you your crazy good sack games, your fumbles, force, your kick returns. They don't really have players that can get a lot of points, so I don't think I could ever see them having like insane upside. But for what it's worth, they went out there and they did what they were expected to do. They held the Panthers to 13. A very good performance from them in terms of the real life side of things, especially seeing as they were missing Tremaine Edmonds. But overall, they just didn't really do too much to get that many fantasy points, which is why they were stuck at around 30. But I don't think you're complaining about that if you're a dictatorship. This is definitely a good step in the right direction. And you're happy with that if you're a dictatorship. That definitely hurts Mr. Steeler Girl. On top of that, dictatorship also had Miles Sanders sitting on the bench, who, this is where you're not too happy if you're a dictatorship. You just traded for this guy. He had 4 carries on the night for a grand total of 10 yards, 2 for -5 when it comes to the ground game, and then 2 for 15 when it comes to the receiving game. He just can't get it working on the ground at all. But you've seen in previous videos and all season, he's been struggling on the ground game all season, where he fucking gets 1 yard per carry sometimes, as you saw in that game with 13 carries and 19 yards. He just can't get shit done when it comes to the ground game, but when it comes to the receiving game, he's able to make it work. He's basically like the better Jaylen Warren. Maybe not better, but another version of Jaylen Warren. That's the best way I can describe him. Unless they start using him as like an exclusively receiving back role, I can't really see him being that usable in fantasy, to be honest. Maybe he can go out there and start earning some snaps back, but 2 rushes for -5 yards is definitely not how you do it, to say the least, especially against a shitty Bears offense. Then we'll go ahead and look at MILF against Big Yawners. Both of these teams kind of stank it up a little bit this week. You had Bryce Young, who, like I said, is not looking good. He was ignoring wide open receivers pretty much all night. To his credit, he was out DJ Chark, which is the wide receiver too. But yeah, he had 185 passing yards, 3 rushing attempts for 18 yards. He did have 1 pretty nice 40-yard completion overall, but it was just not a good night for either him or Tyson Bagent. And you can tell watching these offenses, they're pretty much scripting their offense to be to the point where they don't trust their quarterback so much. They're just telling the quarterback, whatever you do, don't throw an interception and don't fumble. That's pretty much what they're doing. So you saw both teams pretty much never take any shots at all throughout the entire game. They both were kind of taking the few yards they could get, punt, take the few yards you can get, punt until the teams eventually fucking scored. It was kind of sad, but yeah, Bryce Young definitely isn't looking great. I definitely think MILF might be regretting not picking up or keeping Gardner Minshew now, but we'll just have to wait and see as the season goes on. Bryce Young has only had 1 good game in terms of fantasy, and it was only whenever he was getting his ass kicked by Detroit and got garbage time points. Other than that, yeah, he's really not looking good. So a few points in the red is exactly not what you're wanting to hear if you're MILF here, but at least you're still somewhat competitive in this game with the help of Jack Sanborn going in the red a little bit. Now, I could have warned Big Yawners that this would have probably happened. I actually didn't think Big Yawners would still be hanging on to Jack Sanborn at this point. But for what it's worth, Sanborn didn't have a bad game. He just didn't have those 20 points I advertised in the previous week for matchup or for biggest player on free agency. My suspicion for the reason that is because the main starting linebacker, Tremaine Edmonds, that actually usually goes in there and makes all the tackles, was supposed to play up until the night before. And so Jack Sanborn pretty much had a last second to go in there and get shit done type thing. And yeah, that definitely didn't help. On top of that, the Panthers barely fucking ran the ball, which is what Jack Sanborn is known for stopping. Sanborn isn't really known for the pass coverage, but for what it's worth, he still had 7 total tackles and a pass deflect. So take that as you will. It's a okay game, a bit disappointing. But I didn't expect a huge game this week out of him, kind of like I did last week. But I will say, if you're Big Yawners, if you notice Tremaine Edmonds happens to be labeled as out, for example, in the upcoming weeks, that's when you start Jack Sanborn. If he has a time ahead of time to go in there and look, especially against teams that run the ball a lot, that's when Sanborn will be good. But this is a few points in the red for both teams. I don't think either team are crying themselves to sleep, but it is a very crucial win for MILF here. It's a crucial win for both of them, but it's a lot more important for MILF, seeing as he could be eliminated from the playoffs this week. So either way, this is good news for Big Yawners, better news than for MILF, because Big Yawners is less than a quarter of a point off, while MILF is about 5 points down now. Then we'll look at Booty and Karen's husband. Booty didn't have anyone starting. Karen's husband had Cole Kmet. he went out there and had a pretty solid night. He had a rushing attempt for a whole yard, that carried him. He would have just had negative points without that. But anyway, he had the 5 catches for 45 yards. A solid night. You can't really ask for too much more. If he gets touchdowns, that makes this solid night go from solid to great. And you'll take it. This is pretty solid. He's getting 7 targets, 5 catches, 45 yards. Pretty good. Then Karen's husband also had, on their defensive side of things, Chuba Hubbard, who went for 9 for 23, had 2 catches for 16 yards. Had 9 rushing attempts. He was pretty much getting stuffed at the line every time. He wasn't really able to do too much here. Getting less than 3 yards per carry. He had 2 catches for 16 yards. Like I said, Sanborn didn't really have too much opportunity to do too much. That's why I wasn't concerned with big yawners. But yeah, Chuba Hubbard, Miles Sanders, neither of them can move this ball, and you can argue it for being a lack of running back skill. You can argue it for being lack of O-line, whatever you want to call it. It's just not looking good one way or another from a fantasy side of things. And looking towards the brighter side of news for Karen's husband, he did have Deontay Foreman, who had 21 rushing attempts, almost had 4 yards per carry. He did have a rushing touchdown and 2 catches for 12 yards. He did okay. That's probably the okayest performance you can get in the NFL. It's not bad. It's solid overall. He's getting a lot of volume. He's getting a touchdown, so that's what you want to see from a fantasy side of things, which gives you a good fantasy performance. When I say okay, I obviously mean real life, but overall, I do think that his numbers will start dropping with the return of Khalil Herbert in the upcoming weeks. But for now, that was a pretty solid performance from Karen's husband. Maybe you can go out there and trade Deontay Foreman for something while he still has a little bit of value. That would be my recommendation if you're Karen. But for now, you go about a point in the green. Solid news for Karen. This is a big matchup this week between him and Booty, where they're fighting for the division title. Then you have Justin Lake's kids and Pussy. First of all, Justin Lake's kids has DJ Moore, who had 5 catches for 58 yards on 9 targets. He also had a rushing yard. Thank Christ for that 1 rushing yard. But anyway, he had a okay night. You'd hope for more out of a wide receiver 1, but when you have a backup quarterback throwing to you, you can't expect too much upside with guys like this. Sometimes you'll have those rare opportunities like you saw with Jordan Addison where they can go out there and still get a touchdown to salvage their week. But if you have a backup quarterback throwing to you, unless you get insanely lucky, the top receiver probably isn't going to be doing too much for that week. But he still made it work and still got around 10 points. That's pretty much all you can ask for. Still a few points in the red, though. B-Dog did have TJ Edwards, who went out there and had a total of 12 tackles. TJ Edwards is a lot more known for... He's known for run stopping just like Jack Sanborn, but he can play zone as well. He's usually known for doing stuff like that. He's pretty good. Overall, he's done really good all season. He's basically this year's Roquan Smith. Outside of the game against the Raiders, he must have not been looking at film or something that specific game. But either way, it's a pretty solid game. He had a lot of tackles, and this puts B-Dog a quarter point in the green. And then the guy that actually put B-Dog really far in the green is Jaquan Brisker, who had a total of 9 tackles, a pass deflect, and a tackle for loss. Jaquan Brisker is basically off-brand Jamal Adams, for those of you who are with him. The Bears use him in a lot of blitzing situations, and they don't really use him for as much coverage, but sometimes they do drop him back in coverage too. But either way, it's hard to predict when he'll have those blow-up games. This specific one was a pretty good one. And yeah, he had a grand total of 9 tackles, a pass deflect, a tackle for loss. You can't really ask for much more. This is good news for Justin Lake's kids overall, but he's not going to set his fucking team anyway, so it doesn't matter. Pussy's just going to walk off with the freebie, most likely. Oh, well, before I actually move on to the next part of the video, I do want to mention this. Pussy did have Montez Sweat on his bench, and I've warned Pussy about this a few times. And if you happen to have Montez Sweat in any other league, I definitely do warn you again with this. With Montez Sweat, now that he's traded to the Bears, he's still a good player. It's not like he's playing bad. But the problem with a star player getting traded to a bad team that doesn't have anybody else on that D-line that's going to help him out is he draws almost all of the coverage, which is what you saw against the Panthers here. He's drawing double teams. He was drawing pretty much the Panthers' entire offensive line to fucking try to stop this dude. And we'll actually talk about it whenever we get to the game side of things. As I predicted, this did open things up for Yannick Ngakoue, who got a sack. But as for Montez Sweat, it is very, very, very difficult to trust this guy from a fantasy side of things. I think if you were Pussy, you probably would have wanted to try and trade him as he got traded to the Bears, because, yeah, it's getting hard to trust him at this point. And I can't see him really having any sort of revelation unless the Bears somehow turn Yannick Ngakoue into fucking Jared Allen. But I don't think they will. Then we'll look at the game side of things. Final score was 13-16 in this shit show. If anybody bet the over on total punts, they probably won $1 million. Not really, anyway. We'll just look into the player stats. You had Bryce Young, who went 21 for 38. The whole game was just fucking check down central for the most part. And both QBs didn't really do that good. Neither offense could really get going. It wasn't even that the defenses were anything special. It was just the offenses fucking sucked. Um, and yeah, Bryce Young has definitely looked disappointing so far. Am I saying all of it's his fault? No, but there were some plays that were inexcusable to say the least, that he was making like stupid throws and just inaccurate throws overall. You had Chuba Hubbard, who really isn't helping him out in terms of the run game. 9 for 23, averaging 2.5 yards per carry is terrible in the NFL. The average is around 4 yards per carry. I think it's like 4.1 to be exact. Bryce Young actually did get some mobile plays going where he had 6 yards per carry on the ground, 3 for 18. That's solid for what it's worth. Miles Sanders couldn't do shit. Fucking Blackshear couldn't do shit. The whole running back room for Carolina is just looking horrible overall, and it's hard for me to say that I'd trust any of these guys from a fantasy side of things. On the receiving side of things, you had a big 45-yard gain for, I don't even know who Strahan is. I don't think he's worth mentioning because I haven't seen his name all season. But he did have that 45-yard catch. The number one receiver was Adam Thielen with 6 catches for 42 yards on 10 targets. The number 2 receiver, even though there's a pretty big drop-off between him and Thielen, was Jonathan Mingo, the rookie they got pretty late in the draft. He had 3 catches for 20 yards. You had Tommy Tremble get 3 catches for 16. Chuba Hubbard had a few catches for 16. That was pretty solid. Same with Miles Sanders. He had 2 for 15. I don't know why these Panthers aren't trying to utilize their receiving backs. That's what both Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders are known for, is being really good receiving backs. They're not really known for powering it as much. Miles Sanders used to be pretty good at being elusive in high school, but since all these in high school and college, but since all these injuries have been taking place, it hasn't really looked the same since. But either way, I think that's the way you use these guys. You had Hayden Hurst, who had 2 catches for 14 yards. They haven't really been using him since the early weeks. Then they had Terrence Marshall for a catch for 11, and Rasheed Blackshear for a catch for 6. The number one tackler on the team, and this is probably one of the few times I've been able to say this season, is a defensive tackle, Derek Brown. It is very rare that defensive tackles get a lot of tackles. They're more known for sacks and tackle for losses, sure, but not many tackles overall. But when you're playing against an offensive line that's as ass as the Bears, anything's possible, I guess. Derek Brown had a total of 10 tackles, 9 tackles solo, a tackle assist. I don't think I'd trust him from a fantasy side of things. It's just very nice to see a big stat line like that for a defensive tackle. I thought it was pretty humorous. Frankie Louvu's looking pretty good for Toxic. He had 6 tackle solo and 5 assists, 11 total. You had Dante Jackson, who had 5 tackles solo and 2 assists. He used to be a pretty good corner in fantasy, but he kind of fell off in terms of fantasy, but he's still a solid corner in real life. I don't really know many of these other guys. Von Bell came back. He only had 4 total tackles in the game. That was a bit of a disappointment. Kamu Gruger-Hill didn't do too much. And yeah, other than that, I don't really think there's anyone here worth mentioning. There was the absence of Jeremy Chin, if I'm not mistaken, in this specific game, because I didn't notice him whenever I was watching all the film in the game. Yeah, I think he actually missed. So obviously the Panthers defense could be a little bit better than they did, although it wasn't their fault they lost. To be honest, the offenses were just atrocious. You did have Eddie Pinheiro, who went 2 for 3. And for those of you who don't understand what it's like in Chicago, it's just pretty humorous because they were in the position where they had that last field goal at the end of the game. It was about a 50-yard field goal, maybe a bit more. I think it was like 59 yards he was expected to make. And this was in Chicago, keep in mind. One of the windiest cities in the fucking world. And they go in there and they expect Eddie Pinheiro to kick a 59-yard field goal. That was pretty humorous because it wasn't even close. Well, it was kind of close, but it was pretty short. But anyway, it was a very stupid decision to try and have him go for the field goal. It wasn't really that realistic to ask him. I don't think the kick is anything of concern. It was a very unrealistic kick for them to expect him to make overall, because even Justin Tucker's not going to make a fucking 60-yard field goal in Chicago. It's just not going to happen. Unless you're facing the side that the wind's blowing, it's just not going to happen in a game like Chicago. I thought that was pretty funny and worth mentioning at least. But I'm not concerned about his accuracy overall. That was just kind of a stupid situation. Then we'll move on to the Bears side of things. Actually, wait a minute. I just realized something on the defense. There was actually no sacks or interceptions that game. Um, there was no interceptions at all. I thought for sure the Panthers had at least one sack. I guess not. Tyson Badgett was basically Bryce Young in disguise, so you could make an argument that he was worthy of being the first overall pick this year. Same thing. They used him for checkdowns. They told him not to make any stupid decisions, and that's pretty much what the Bears did, and that's how they won the game. The main difference that I would say or point to as to why the Bears won over the Panthers would be that they actually had a running game. Um, it wasn't great, but at least it was okay, and I think that's what kind of won them the game in the end with all the punting that happened in this game. Uh, the yards, the yards game is what they might call it, or the fight for yards as each drive went on. The Bears slowly pushed and pushed until they got more points overall in the end. Deontay Foreman had 21 carries for 80 yards and a touchdown. That's a pretty solid performance, or a pretty okay performance. Rashawn Johnson had 5 for 18, so that's okay, getting about 3 yards per carry, just a bit more. You had Travis Scott, or no, I think it's Tyler Scott, have a rush for 16. Tyson Badgett went 6 for 12. Darrington Evans had 2 carries for 5. Other than that, there wasn't really much worth mentioning. At least they did have that running game, which got them the touchdown, and I would say is probably the main reason I can point to as to why they got the win instead of the Panthers. The top receiver was DJ Moore, 5 catches for 58. Cole Kmet went 5 for 45. Tyler Scott had 1 catch for 15. Rashawn Johnson, see, he's also a receiving back. The Bears are using him like he's supposed to be used. He's a receiving back. He didn't have too great of a night last night, but at least the Bears are trying to use him. He had 4 catches for 14 yards. So if the Bears are able to start getting him a lot of targets, he could go in there and be like an off-brand Alvin Kamara where he gets 25 targets per game. I'm joking, but uh, it is seeming like the Bears are trying to at least implement him into the game plan, which is pretty solid news for the Bears moving forward. They had Darnell Mooney have 2 catches for 14. Deontay Foreman had 2 for 12. And then Equanimous St. Brown had a catch for 4. Thank Jesus Christ the Bears have Equanimous St. Brown. They might have lost without him. Um, the main tackler on the Bears was TJ Edwards, but the other guy that was looking pretty good was Kyler Gordon, who had a total of 8. A lot of Bears fans are losing their shit over Kyler Gordon after he fucking got cooked up all game. He didn't really get cooked up all game because a lot of the times Bryce Young would either completely ignore the receiver that was wide open or he'd throw a horrible pass. So Kyler Gordon had a way higher corner rating than he probably should have, and Bears were losing their shit about this. Yeah, I'm not really too big of a fan of him. He might be fantasy liable. I don't know. I haven't seen his stats yet. But either way, I've checked him earlier this season, and he didn't seem too consistent. Um, Jaquan Brisker had a total of 9 tackles. He is looking pretty fantasy solid. And yeah, he went out there and had 9 tackles as well, and he also had that tackle for loss. Um, and here's what I was talking about with Pussy when it comes to Montez Sweat. Look at the sacks and the distribution of sacks between everyone. Remember how Montez Sweat had absolutely nothing? The reason the Bears got Montez Sweat was not so he could go out there and be a beast and be the next TJ Watt and put up 20 to 30 sacks in a season. They got Montez Sweat so that way they can use him to be the distraction or use him to take all the coverage off of these other guys and let these other guys do what they're good at. Justin Jones goes out there and gets a sack. Yannick Ngakoue goes out there and gets a sack. And Rasheem Green also goes out there and gets a sack. This is kind of what I predicted with the Bears because it didn't make sense that they didn't go for Chase Young at first. If they would have went for Chase Young, I probably would have expected him to start getting some sacks. But with a guy like Montez Sweat, I do think he's more of a distraction for the rest of the players because it is kind of odd how they have a team of really bulky players and then they go out there and get a speed rusher. But either way, that's kind of what I've been thinking this year. I don't like Montez Sweat moving forward from a fantasy side of things, but maybe you can keep an eye on these defensive linemen and maybe one of them can start standing out. Who knows? But either way, Sweat definitely helps. And then the Bears also went perfect on their kicks for what it's worth, where they had Cairo Santos actually nail a 54-yarder. That was pretty impressive. But other than that, there wasn't really too much worth mentioning. This was a fucking shit show. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you later.